Natural 20.
What? Rain from the sky! JJ, what am I doing here?
So I saw the Dungeons & Dragons movie, Honor Among Us, and I thought it was alright. It's nowhere near the best movie of the year by far, but it's definitely leagues above that other Dungeons & Dragons movie from 2000. That said though, this movie isn't anywhere near astounding by any means. As soon as the first trailers dropped for this film, I kind of expected it to just be Guardians of the Galaxy, but in the fantasy setting, which you could easily argue that Guardians of the Galaxy is just Dungeons & Dragons in space. Part of the reason for that is the fact that the characters in Guardians of the Galaxy are not perfect superheroes. They're flawed. They have shortcomings that the other people in the Guardians of the Galaxy have to make up for. The formula for a great party-based adventure was already there, they just had to change the setting from space to the Forgotten Realms, which is the canon setting of Dungeons & Dragons, or I guess the default setting. Basically, the main character Edgin, I kept thinking it was Edwin in my notes for some reason, but it's Edgin. It definitely sounds like a made-up name, which, you know, par for the course for Dungeons & Dragons. Edgin does a heist for somebody 2 years before the events of this movie take place, where he's trying to steal a tablet of resurrection to bring back a wife of his who was killed by red wizards, but him and Holga, a human barbarian, were betrayed by somebody else in that heist and are locked up in Neverwinter prison, in which they immediately bust out of. So once the two of them are out, they decide, hey, we need to go to Neverwinter and find Forge Fitzwilliam, one of the other guys from our heist, and try to figure out what the hell happened. But then it turns out that Forge was the one who originally betrayed them in that heist 2 years ago, and now he's got Edgin's daughter. So the two of them escape Neverwinter and decide, you know what, we need to bust into his vault to get that tablet of resurrection, because that was kind of the whole reason I went on this heist, so I could bring my dead wife back, which involves recruiting Simon, a sorcerer who escaped that original heist, and Doric, a druid who is supposed to be a tiefling? And that's pretty much the plot. There's not much else to it. It really is just a simply clear, defined adventure with an end goal that is clear from the get-go, and I kind of like that they kept it that simple. As far as the characters go, Edgin is pretty much the face of the party and nothing else. He's kind of useless throughout the entirety of the film except for a few major decisions and one loot to the head.
One for her wimpy husband, Chester.
Which granted, the film points out itself, but aside from the fact that it's Chris Pine and Edgin loves his daughter very much, he does not really contribute much to the story aside from being the main character. Holga is probably my favorite of the entire party. She's brash, she's straightforward, and she really doesn't give a shit, which is what you would expect from a barbarian. No notes. She's genuinely the one person that got a smile out of me from anything she said. Simon's a lot of fun with the party, being the self-conscious and extremely self-deprecating sorcerer of the group. And I don't remember much about Doric in the movie. I think her performance was fine. What confuses me is the way that she's written. Like, okay, so in the movie she says that she's a tiefling, and there's like a small line implying that she's like half human or something, but that never comes up again. Her stat block just says that she is a tiefling and doesn't mention anything about her being half human. Says she was raised by a wood elf enclave, and that's about it. What confuses me is just, why does she just look like a human with horns and apparently a tail? Like, I went to this movie with two other people, one of which is a dungeon master themselves, and neither of us noticed the tail until like halfway through the movie. I think there might have been a throwaway line at some point implying that she was supposed to be half human or something, but the stat block just says she's just a tiefling and mentions nothing about the half human part. Which, even if she was half human, she constantly says throughout the film that she hates humans because of her backstory. So why does she look like a human if she's not supposed to be one aside from the horns and the tail? Which that just kind of ties into a main concern I have in terms of world building as a whole. Why is everyone mostly just human? And no, I don't just mean humanoid as in there are some elves and like one dwarf in the movie. I mean mostly everyone in the world world is human and not really any other race, which is kind of strange for Dungeons & Dragons. The player handbook features 9 playable races, and the other source books expand that number to, I think, around 42? I think with all the books that I have, I can pick from around 35, if I'm counting that right. Some of them are humanoid, yes, but there are a lot of them that make them at least distinct from each other. You got Goliaths, you got Githyanki, you've got changelings, you could play as a goblin if you wanted to. As far as non-humanoid creatures in this movie, I think I can count on one hand all of the ones that I saw throughout it. 2 Dragonborns, 1 Aarakocra, and 2 Tabaxi. And the 2 Tabaxi just made giant cat noises instead of just speaking common like they're supposed to be able to. It smacks more to me like they were more focused on the main story of these human characters and didn't really put that much time into the world building. In fact, there's another scene in the film that demonstrates this perfectly. Spoilers for D&D Among Us. There's your warning, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so Holga, the barbarian, was apparently banished from her clan because she fell in love with, I want to say he's a halfling. I say halfling because of the way the scene is designed. I'll get into that in a minute. There's a point in the film where she goes back to her home village to get some things, and she visits this halfling while she's trying to do that. In this scene, they're in a house together in which all of the furniture inside of the house is human size, it's Holga sized, so she looks perfectly fine, whereas this very obvious man in front of a green screen is just sitting on an oversized prop chair to make him look like he's smaller than he actually is. This never looks convincing. In fact, it almost breaks entirely at the very end when the two of them kind of hold hands for a second and his hand has to grow in size because it's out of frame to fit into her hand. Even though, honestly, his should be like a small baby hand to her. Not important, that's not why I'm bringing this up. I get that in comparison to Holga, they were trying to show how small this person was supposed to be. And that would be perfectly fine, except when you take into consideration that in the script, he says that he built that house for the two of them to live in. And when she was exiled, he just stayed living in the house. If this halfling built the house for the two of them, why is everything in the house just Holga-sized? The front door is massive in a way where he has to reach up to the doorknob to open it. All of the chairs are too big for him to realistically sit in. Everything is just too big for him. Especially since if he's the one building the house, most likely he's got a say in what furnishings go in the house as well. They didn't come pre-built with the house. There's a reason why I'm confident in saying that Holga's ex is supposed to be a halfling. It's because this scene is very clearly trying to be evocative of Fellowship of the Ring when Gandalf visits Bilbo in Hobbiton Manor, because that house is designed in a way where it's the perfect size for Bilbo because he's a 2 to 3 foot tall hobbit, whereas Gandalf is like a 6-7 foot giant in comparison, and it's shot and built in a way where it looks like that. Bilbo fits the scene perfectly where Gandalf looks wildly out of place, and that's on purpose. He's in an environment that is not designed to accommodate someone so large. So if a halfling who built a house for him and someone who is twice his size as a human, realistically, if he's going to build the house and he knows what he's doing, he's going to build the house in a way that accommodates the both of them without inconveniencing each other. This is evocative of a reoccurring issue that just keeps happening throughout the entire movie. Outside of the plot of this story, I don't really think there's much of a world outside of the movie. Yeah, they mention places like Baldur's Gate 3 or 4 times, but I think that's only really sort of like a reference. Unless you intend on showing Baldur's Gate at some point, there's really no reason for you to keep bringing up Baldur's Gate. And this isn't necessarily a problem that's unique to Dungeons & Dragons or even to this movie as a whole. This is kind of a bigger issue with all of fantasy writing in general. Like, take Skyrim, for example. If you ever get arrested, they throw you in a cell, they leave you with some ragged clothes and like 1 lockpick. But they don't do anything with you if you happen to be a spellcaster? Like, you can still conjure a bow and arrow in your hands, or if you're playing Oblivion, you can just wave your hands in front of the locked gate and just unlock it. That's just a spell you can buy in the main game. Dungeons & Dragons, and especially the Forgotten Realms, is very susceptible to suffering from this exact same problem. None of the city guards are prepared to handle someone who can cast magic when it's a common thing that people are able to do? Like, this is something I've had to think about as a dungeon master. You can bet that if there are a bunch of bandits coming in that can easily cast Fireball at will, you can bet that some of those guards are going to be trained on how to use a counterspell scroll. Oh man, I hope none of my players are watching this. Don't get me wrong, there are some moments in this film that I think are really strong. The fight against Themberchild in the Underdark I think is the strongest point in the entire film. It feels chaotic, the main characters are acting as quickly as they can with no plan whatsoever. They get out using some pretty creative thinking. This is a strong scene, I like this.
Damn, boy, he's thick! Boy, that's a thick-ass boy!
It's just that for a fantasy movie, it didn't put much thought into the world building as much as the effort they put into the action scenes and the main characters, which you kind of need a balance of all of those things. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm fully aware that these issues could only be relevant to me. I am writing a book right now that focuses heavily on the effects of magic in a fantasy setting as the main premise, so I'm fully aware that my mind is already geared to look for this kind of thing. That being said though, Dungeons & Dragons is a game that is designed with creativity as the main focal point, and there are a lot of players and dungeon masters out there who put a lot of thought into this kind of thing, where they think about how their characters would fit into the world that the dungeon master has created. And there are a lot of dungeon masters who put a lot of thought into world building for their players. So I don't know, maybe putting some emphasis into that might be encouraging for the people who play the game? You know, focusing on what you can bring to the game? Well, I would say that, but then again, we did see Hasbro try to overturn the open gaming license for Dungeons & Dragons and screw over third-party content creators just so they could monetize the game a little more, so who knows, maybe not, forget I said anything. But for a movie that's based off of a game that is designed entirely off of insane creativity, both from the players and the dungeon masters, this feels like a watered-down, safe approach in making a Dungeons & Dragons movie. That feels like the best way I could put it. It's a safe movie. It's safe for people to come see it and see the same tropes that they've always seen, just with Dungeons & Dragons slapped onto it. At least that's certainly what it feels like. There are some people who are saying that this was based off of a Dungeons & Dragons campaign that they played behind the scenes and then wrote the script around that. You know, like a whole Vox Machina type of thing. But if that is the case, then either A, the dungeon master for that campaign ran the most boring, safe, and bog standard campaign they could have possibly run, or B, they just wrote a generic fantasy Guardians of the Galaxy-esque adventure and just slapped Dungeons & Dragons' name and creatures onto it. Which, honestly, I think I believe that over scenario A. That said though, in comparisons to other Dungeons & Dragons properties, or properties that started from Dungeons & Dragons, I think the better approach would be something like Vox Machina. It genuinely does feel like they took a campaign of Dungeons & Dragons that they played and adapted it wholesale into an animated TV show. Vox Machina feels a lot more chaotic, which is kind of the nature of Dungeons & Dragons, and I never got that impression from Honor Among Thieves.
Doom? We don't know the meaning of the word.
Well, I certainly don't.
But again, just to re-emphasize, I did enjoy my time with this movie. I had fun, and if the movie does well, they're probably going to make more. But if they do end up making any sequels, then I'd love for them to take a lot stronger risks than they took in this movie. You know, maybe permanently kill some main characters, which is a common thing that happens in Dungeons & Dragons. And I'd also love to see more shenanigans scenes like the Speak with Dead scene where they're trying to talk to a bunch of corpses. That scene did go on a little too long in my opinion, but I'd love to see more scenes like that. Scenes that just completely break the flow of the story just because the characters are stuck on something. Might I suggest making the main characters have trouble with a door? I don't know what it is about locked doors in Dungeons & Dragons, but my players had more trouble with that than they ever did with a giant demon spider. The door door is locked and reinforced on the other side. No heat metal is not going to change that, and no ramming into it harder won't break it down either. Please just go around. I'm begging you. Anyways, check this one out if you're interested in it. I still did have fun even though I have some major writing issues with it in general, but it is at the very least an improvement over the last Dungeons & Dragons movie, and it definitely won't be the most aggravating video game movie that I see this year. And I'm giving Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves 6 gold pieces out of a platinum. You get it? Because that's a twist on the normal rating, because you need 10 gold pieces to make 1 platinum, and I only gave it 6 gold pieces. It's a 6 out of 10 is what I'm trying to say.